To start, a quick backdrop. We're in Afghanistan and it's the late 1970s. Due to the ongoing Cold War, global tensions were, well, frosty. Anti-communism sentiment ran deep for much of the world, and we'll see that play a major part as motivation for the events of today's story.
So the communists used the lie as a weapon, a shield, and a tool.
In fact, many world leaders of the time shared one pretty similar, if drastic, opinion. The spread of communism anywhere threatened freedom everywhere. So, when communism began to spread in the Persian Gulf and surrounding countries, including Afghanistan, in the last years of the decade, it was a big deal. It seemed like a resurgence of the same philosophies and power struggles that the world had recently watched play out in Cuba, in the Vietnam War, in the Dominican Republic, and, well, most recently at the time in Angola in 1976. To many, this latest emergence of communism may have felt like an almost forgotten nightmare happening in the daytime, or at least extremely unpleasant deja vu. Many even saw it as the very beginnings of a third world war, as we'll see in a moment. That's understandable then that the United States would throw everything it had at the situation to stop communism in its tracks. However, the United States may have been a little leery of overtly engaging with anti-communism efforts in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's leadership had a tricky relationship with the Soviet Union, and the United States and the Soviet Union, obviously, it's the Cold War, not on brilliant terms. This made it difficult for the US to provide apparent, clearly visible, and clearly traceable support. So they didn't. Instead, the CIA found a loophole, a backdoor way to help quash Afghan communism. An inconsequential initiative, a strategic side project, just a little aid program that, no big deal, grew into one of the longest and most expensive CIA operations of all time. Operation Cyclone, this multi-billion-dollar CIA program, has gone down in history for being extremely costly and for the storm of criticism it triggered well after the program was over and done. For years, people the world over have been wondering, given what happens at the end of Operation Cyclone, was its colossal investment justified? It all seems a bit familiar here in 2021, doesn't it? Here's a spoiler though. Towards the end of Operation Cyclone, Pakistan's Prime Minister reached out to the American president to issue a ghoulish warning about Operation Cyclone's progress. The warning? You're creating a Frankenstein. Sounds promising. Let's jump in. Early 1978, Afghanistan. The country's president, Mohammed Daoud Khan, was under a lot of pressure. Afghanistan and the Soviet Union had been quite close for a long time. The Soviet Union had even funneled lots of money into Afghan infrastructure projects over the preceding decades. However, Daoud did not appreciate the way that the Soviet Union tried to use that relationship to influence other things that were happening in Afghanistan. For example, their foreign policies and even the way that the different groups forming within the Afghan government related to one another. Recently, in an attempt to set some boundaries, President Daoud had traveled to Moscow to inform, or perhaps remind, the Soviet Union that Afghanistan was a free state and that the Soviet Union would not have any say in how the country governed itself. Now, this was a power play that the Soviet Union did not appreciate. It wasn't even a move condoned unanimously by Daoud's own government. There were many in Afghanistan who believed that partnering more fully with Russia would give Afghanistan some much-needed power. Under Daoud, these political disagreements between parts of his government festered and tension grew until the once unified government, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the PDPA, split into two factions, the moderate Parcham and the more communist-leaning Kauks. A Kauk plot began to simmer, one that involved overthrowing the current government and joining forces with the Soviets. So let's zoom out for a moment and think about this not from the government's angle, but from the point of view of an Afghan going about their day-to-day life that spring. Perhaps, if it would help, here's a question. How can you tell if a revolution's about to happen? You're walking around your bustling metropolis, your skin maybe prickles, perhaps there's an odd traffic pattern that your subconscious picks up on, or a distinct lack of sound that seems suspicious. For the people living in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, on the 27th of April 1978, there were only a handful of clues that their city was about to be the site of a revolution. The first clue involved a tank column heading directly towards the city. There was also smoke of unknown origin floating around, which is never a good sign. There were also men in military uniforms guarding major intersections. Shots were heard near the Ministry of Interior, but that itself wasn't conclusive. But then there was a final, subtle clue that would arrive later that day when the government-owned Radio Afghanistan ran an announcement. Over the speakers citywide, it was declared that the Khalqs, one of the factions within the Afghan government, were overthrowing the government. The next morning, the city's terrified population woke up to an eerie quiet, and a new president, Nur Mohammed Taraki, a communist-leaning member of the Khalqs, and had seized control. The coup, it was complete. Taraki's stated motives for wanting power sounded good on paper. He wanted to improve access to education and improve land laws. Fantastic goals, definitely worthy of a coup. Unfortunately, working towards those goals proved difficult and dangerous. Many of Taraki's reforms led to riots, revolts, and violent demonstrations among the people of Afghanistan. Taraki did not know how to quiet this unrest peacefully, and he often asked the Soviet Union for help controlling his constituents. Additionally, Taraki's cabinet was not exactly stable. For most of his time in power, Taraki was on the losing end of a power struggle with his deputy prime minister. Taraki even tried and failed to assassinate a member of his own government. Under Taraki's leadership, the relationship between the Khalqs and the Parcham deteriorated, resulting in the banishment of many Parcham officials. Taraki also made a contentious if predictable decision. He and the PDPA signed a treaty with the Soviet Union. Those opposed to this launched an uprising in eastern Afghanistan, which turns into a civil war. The government forces versus the guerrilla mujahideen. Mujahideen is a term that generally refers to Islamic fighters, generally those attacking non-Muslim forces. In this story, they're seen fighting this new communist government. The nearby Pakistani government, not psyched about communism's spread, supported the rebel fighters, giving them access to covert training centers. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union sent thousands of military advisors to support Taraki's government. Still technically a civil war, no outside country was actually stepping in, there was just a whole bunch of man behind the curtain stuff. But it's definitely about to become something even bigger than that. Now, let's shift focus for a moment from Afghanistan to America. The new communist treaty with Taraki set the United States government on high alert. Officials in the United States noticed Pakistan's assistance of the anti-communist rebels and suddenly saw a way to provide aid that wouldn't require their on-site support. In July of 1979, President Jimmy Carter authorized Operation Cyclone, a covert CIA program that would send funding and supplies to support anti-communist guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan. For the first few years of assistance, the budget for Operation Cyclone was about $20 to $30 million. A couple of months later, throughout the continuing Afghan civil war, another coup occurred. In September of 1979, a man named Hafizullah Amin deposed Taraki, a coup orchestrated by Taraki's fellow Khalqs within the PDPA government. Now, remember, the Soviet Union and Taraki, they were close. With true enemy of my enemy is my friend logic on display, the Soviet Union immediately thought that Hafizullah Amin was no friend of theirs. They incorrectly assumed that he was even a US sympathizer. This meant that it was time for the Soviets to take further action. Soviet special forces invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979 and killed Amin. In his place, the Soviets installed a man named Babrak Karmal as the president of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union then deployed even more Soviet troops to help stabilize Afghanistan. This invasion officially turned a civil war into something much bigger. This also required more funds from Operation Cyclone to meet a more robust foe. Immediately after the invasion, President Carter wanted to respond vigorously to such a dangerous provocation. He made a televised speech to announce sanctions on the Soviet Union, promised renewed aid to Pakistan, and to commit the United States to the Persian Gulf and Afghanistan's defense. A quote from him at the time: "The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War." Certainly big words. And these big words were followed, as it turns out, by even bigger money. 1980 was President Jimmy Carter's year of unpopular decisions. In January, he terminated something called the Soviet Wheat Deal, a series of grain shipments from the United States to Russia that many had hoped would lessen Cold War tensions. These suddenly cancelled grain exports had been really helpful for American farmers, so this was definitely a hit on public sentiment towards Carter. Then Carter boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics, which happened to be in Moscow because of the Soviet Union's Afghan invasion. He also reinstated the draft. Super popular move, dude. A cancelled grain deal, no Olympics, more war. It's not a great look for Carter. 1980, would be the last year of his presidency. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became president. Reagan increased funding for Operation Cyclone and deployed CIA paramilitary officers to help support the Mujahideen forces as they fought the Soviets. The strategy enhanced the rebel fighters' ability to fight by training them and assisting with tactical and logistical support, but the US would never actually get involved themselves. No Americans trained or had direct contact with the Mujahideen. The CIA itself never had more than a few operatives in the region, partially because it didn't want to be blamed for anything that happened. The support Operation Cyclone was able to give went through an intermediary for the funds prior to being funneled into Pakistan. The same went for many of the other types of support sent to the Afghan resistance groups. And what was one of the other types of support? Well, it was weapons. Massive weapons. And lots of them. The Stinger anti-aircraft missile, for example, these missiles help ground troops deal with helicopters and low-flying airplanes extremely effectively. Whereas previously, Soviet aircraft would tend to have literally the upper hand because they could bomb, strafe, or do surveillance work without the risk of retaliation, the Stinger missile gave the Afghan fighters an easy way to eliminate these threats. The United States sent the Mujahideen huge amounts of Stinger missiles in 1986, and the Soviets did not like that very much at all. The influx of these shoulder-held, easy-to-use missiles changed the tide of the war. In July 1987, the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, with the last of the Soviets actually gone by early 1989. The potential build-up to World War III, in the eyes of many, had been effectively managed. It's easy to imagine, perhaps, that President Carter, the man who'd made the comparison to the latest World War, released a sigh of relief. Sounds like a happy ending, and if we ended it there, Operation Cyclone might be seen as a success story. As we know, though, that's not how history works. In history, there are always consequences you can trace out of events like this, and we'll get into those in a moment. But first, here's a hypothetical question. When you spent a decade funneling really expensive and really pretty intense weaponry through one country into another, what do you think the odds are that none of those weapons would fail to reach the intended recipients? What are the odds that 0 of the highly trained guerrilla fighters would choose to rebel against a faraway country's influence? How likely is it that in a combat program with seemingly endless resources, there wouldn't be any corruption? But while you think about that, let's run some numbers. Operation Cyclone ran from 1979 to 1989, a full decade. Not only is it the most expensive CIA program ever, it's the longest. In that time, over 14,000 Soviet troops died or went missing in action. 50,000 more were wounded. Through Operation Cyclone, the United States was able to train and arm approximately 100,000 guerrilla fighters, and in some cases, through Operation Cyclone and Pakistan's influence, they were able to encourage volunteers from across the Persian Gulf to assist the Afghan resistance. Before we discuss just how expensive Operation Cyclone was, there's a key point that we need to consider. The United States provided an incredibly large amount of money, but they weren't the only ones assisting with financial support. For part of Operation Cyclone, Saudi Arabia agreed to match dollar for dollar the money that the CIA was sending to the anti-communist guerrilla warriors. This led to what must have been relatively awkward trips when Operation Cyclone officials had to routinely fly to Saudi Arabia to politely request the money. Aside from Pakistan, the US, and Saudi Arabia, the People's Republic of China and Britain's MI6 and SAS also provided substantial support. Initially in 1979, the budget for Operation Cyclone was $20 to $30 million per year, or $69 million in today's money. By 1987, after Reagan had stepped in, the yearly financial support had grown to $630 million per year, or over $1.5 billion today. However, it can be difficult to track exactly what the United States investment in Operation Cyclone was, particularly when you count the time spent, the personnel involved, inflation, and the massive amounts of weaponry provided in addition to funds. Some sources say that the total financial support from all sources was in the range of $6 to $12 billion. Other sources state that the United States alone contributed over $20 billion. For some perspective, another one of the most expensive recent CIA operations, a 4-year effort in Syria, came to a total bill of about $1 billion. Regardless of the precise amount on the check written to cover Operation Cyclone, this program has earned its title as the most expensive CIA operation ever. It's got the official Guinness World Record for most expensive covert action, and, well, who are we to argue with Guinness? Now, in the world record logs, it's only listed as costing the US $2 billion, so we figure that even with the low estimate, it's easily the winner. Now, anything that massive is going to have some critics. For Operation Cyclone, the program that helped the United States, Pakistan, and Afghanistan with an effort that helped move the Cold War towards its close, I mean, what could the criticism possibly be? The main criticism of the decade-long program is simple. There are those who believe that the US funding of the Mujahideen through Operation Cyclone ultimately led to a lot of chaos in the area and indirect support of groups that would later fuel violent or even terrorist attacks. That's a big claim, so let's take a minute to connect the dots. First, the decision to route US aid through Pakistan led to a huge amount of fraud. Weapons sent over were frequently sold on the local market rather than delivered to the Afghan rebels. Because of this, the area became very corrupt and incredibly dangerous. It's easy to see how some could link Operation Cyclone's efforts to a lot of unintended, but very, very real violence. Then, once the Soviet troops had withdrawn from Afghanistan completely in 1989, the US quickly directed its focus and funding elsewhere. This abrupt end led to a lot of questions over the vast amounts of weapons that Pakistan or other parties might still have. Despite a buyback program for Stinger missiles in the 1990s, many believed that there were groups all around the Persian Gulf who had far more dangerous American-made weapons than perhaps was strictly ideal for everyone. Others criticized the CIA for circulating racist propaganda that deepened the divide between Americans and citizens of other countries. Still, others worried about any effect Operation Cyclone and remaining weaponry would have on the fast-growing militant Islamist movement. Among these people, as we mentioned earlier, was Pakistan's Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, who reached out to the United States President Bush in the late 80s to say, "You are creating a Frankenstein." So while Operation Cyclone may not have directly triggered any years later terrorist attacks, there are some who claim that the chaos left in its wake may have helped. You could see Operation Cyclone as a CIA program that invested well, leveraged international partnerships strategically, and seemingly successfully stopped World War III in its tracks. You could also see the program as an overly ambitious initiative that made life difficult for millions of United States citizens and even possibly the source of the first seeds of a lot of further violence. Was the CIA, as the Pakistani Prime Minister pointed out back in the 80s, unintentionally creating Frankenstein, or rather his monster? Or was this a well-intentioned, if very expensive program that was just trying its best to protect global interests and prevent widespread bloodshed? Operation Cyclone's triumphs and its fallout was a huge influence on the Cold War and the relationships between all involved countries for decades after it ended. Regardless of the waves it may have created, this operation will go down in history as one of the most expensive CIA covert operations of all time. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do smash that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.